Hi there, Hashi here, and I'm also known online as Action Movie Dad. I'm the VFX filmmaker behind Action Movie Kid, where I like to mix my home videos with a little bit of movie magic. I recently saw Doctor Strange, which was full of a lot of really cool effects, but one that I thought I could pull off at home was their Sparktastic teleportation ring thingy. Why am I posting this behind the scenes here on Red Giant TV? Well, because for years I've learned a lot from the tutorials provided by Aaron Rabinowitz and Harry Frank and Seth Worley, and I've been fortunate enough to meet these fine folks as well, and I've used their software for many years. This particular effect was perfectly suited for one of my favorite plugins, Trapcode Particular. I've used it on feature films before and also in plenty of Action Movie Kid videos. I'm going to show you how I made this Doctor Strange-style teleportation thing step by step. So first, I had to film my son James in two locations, his school and then later that day at home. Knowing that a hidden cut was a big part of this video, I tried to create a camera movement and framing that was generally similar between the two. I used the photo transfer app to wirelessly upload the video from my phone to my computer, and once I was in After Effects, my next step was to mock up a composition that kind of showed the transition from point A to point B. Now, creating a cut point for this effect required a lot more work than I'd originally planned. I motion tracked the footage, which failed. Then I motion tracked it again, remembering to garbage mat out James. I was able to create stand-in shapes for the ground and that portal that would appear. This stand-in circle was especially important. I used a still frame of point B as a 3D object that would match the camera movement in part A. I used the original circle layer as a reveal matte for that still frame, which I married to a point kind of farther back in space so there'd be a little bit of parallax. Now this part wasn't too bad, but next came the tedious process of rotoing James out of both pieces of footage. And then I used some really overly complicated techniques to hide the cut point. Now I had a pretty great piece of footage to start layering on tons of Doctor Strange style effects into. Now in case you've been living in the dark dimension, you should know about Trapcode Particular. It's one of the most simple and powerful particle systems for After Effects you can imagine. It creates particles that react to the comp camera, and some people have used them to do really cool creative things. When I first saw this ring effect, it reminded me of those spinny firework thingies. Yeah, those. Which are basically several spark-spewing emitters that kind of force a central spoke to spin around and create that cool ring effect. Particular allows you to use comp lights as emitters. Point lights work as locators, and spotlights allow you to aim the particles and kind of set how wide their spray is, etc. To have some simple control over the rotation of this ring, I created a null object and placed it right in the center of that stand-in circle. Next, I created a light and renamed it Emitter so Particular could use it as the particle source, and then parented it to the null in the center of that stand-in circle. And with just a few simple keyframes, I start to get something that kind of remotely resembles that ring of sparks I was going for. And then to make them look more like flying sparks, I enabled the motion blur in the render settings, which turned each particle into a streak of light. Using the physics pull-down, I added some turbulence to the air, and simplified it so it kind of looked like the particles just undulated a little bit. Then I went ahead and tweaked those settings about 4 million more times until I liked what I was seeing, and then I added 2 more light emitters so there were particles coming from 3 points on this circle instead of just the one. Another great feature is the obscuration layers, which are layers that allow you to block or obscure certain particles from rendering. In this case, I was able to use the already in-place ground plane as a way to block the particles as they enter the ground and kind of reappear as they came spouting up on the other side, like they do in the trailer. I used duplicates of my original 3D ground solids to create some kind of interactive lighting effects on the ground as the portal opened. I duplicated the whole particle layer to create a more opaque reddish one that I placed behind it to make those bright particles really pop. Now I blurred out this layer and I turned down the particle count and turned up the particle size. I also made a duplicate layer that has a bunch of the sparks kind of flying to the side using the wind settings that are also in aerodynamics. The beauty of this particle spewing rig is that it's a real 3D thing that you can move, scale, and fly a camera around. In the different drafts, I had to resize and move this ring around a bit so it worked the best, and I'm definitely glad it was simple as manipulating this initial stand-in circle. In fact, with a rig like this, you could use a few simple keyframes and turn this firework into like an all-out beautiful 3D spirograph of insanity. Pretty, right? I added Universe Glow to a 3D adjustment layer using masks to make it grab and enhance the edges of that ring. Then I used Universe Heat Wave on a similar adjustment layer to add some classic heat distortion around the edges of this fiery ring. For James exiting on the other side, my wife suggested adding some sparks that bounced off James' shoes as he got running up to the house. This was both funny, charming, and easy enough to do with Particular's bounce mode. I tracked the footage of James running up to the house, which failed. Then I remembered to motion track it with a garbage mat over James, and then I was able to create a perfect ground plane. I used this ground as reference when I placed a stand-in solid to move through 3D space to visually align where James was. Then, just like before, I created lights labeled emitter, which I parented to that layer, and keyed them to kind of bounce up and down with James' shoes. And then I told Particular to use them as the emitter source. First, I got some simple particles flowing off the shoes, and now I could switch from the air mode to the bounce mode. I designated the ground plane layer as the floor, and turned up the gravity, which made the particles now bounce a few times on the motion-tracked floor. Naturally, I messed with these particle settings about 4 million more times until I really liked what was happening. Then I duplicated this particle layer, ditched the bounce mode, and converted it to a smoky particle emitter to add just a little bit of smoke. Now, I always like to blend practical VFX elements with simulation, so my last step was going through and peppering in live-action stock elements to a few key places where I wanted to see some additional billows of sparks or crackly pops and that kind of thing. Each little detail really combined to make this one of my favorite final effects. As icing on the cake, I used No Light Factory to punch up the moment where the portal first opens and added a bit of wave ripple pulse just as it did. I had topped it off with Overlight from Red Giant Universe to add a bit of exaggerated glow to a few key spots. And there you have it, a pretty decent approximation of a major Hollywood effect using only a few plugins. I learned everything I know from tutorials like the ones on this site. Well, that and lots of practice and mistakes. But I'm grateful to be here sharing these tips with you on one of my favorite sites. Thanks, Aaron and Seth, for all of your great help and support over the years. Please do check out Red Giant Universe and the Trapcode suite as featured in this video, and when you're done with that, feel free to see what my son and I are up to over at Action Movie Kid. Just don't forget to garbage mat out that thing before you try tracking that other thing.